So I was part of the youth group that was involved at the church, and then after my parents noticed that they were not going to be able to remain at Holy Name Cathedral because we were not going to get our own Spanish Mass in the sanctuary. We decided that we would move with other members of the community, and from Holy Name Cathedral we moved to a church, St. Joseph's, which was on Orleans near Division. And there our church groups kind of flourished. We had Caballeros de San Juan. We still had Las Damas de Sagrado. We had the youth group. We had our own retreats. We had our Spanish-speaking Mass with a priest. And we started to organizing in the community. And even though we continued going to school at Holy Name Cathedral. I remember that one of the things that my mother did very early in my life was that she would take me to all sorts of processions, and these processions were not all the time in religious in nature. Some of these processions were protests. And then so I got very involved with what my mom was getting involved with in the church and in the community. She would visit a lot of the people in the community that were having problems with the landlords, and she would be visiting individuals that were having problems with the clinic and not having individuals that could help them at the clinics. I remember that back in those days, many of the young children were being they were being affected by lead poisoning, and I remember that there were individuals in the community that my mom would speak with, and they would come from the clinics and they would speak with them about this is what you need to do in order to make sure that the children are not eating the lead poison paint, because many of these apartment buildings were infected with lead. They were the landlords were not living there, therefore they didn't care what the conditions were, and so my mom was very involved in this kind of a struggle to get them to know that they had to that they could protest, or they could complain, or they could say something about it, or even hold the rent from them. I became very involved with the community. I know that my mother and my father and the people that were around us instilled in us this whole, we are Puertorriqueños. We are Puertorriqueños. And that meant so much to us when we would go to any event and we would say, I belong to the Puerto Rican Congress. And the Puerto Rican Congress was a place that had been started as a mutual aid society, sort of, where Puerto Ricanos who were coming into the Chicago area, they could find help for each other. They would be able to then, if they didn't have birth certificates. They would be able to get that type of assistance through the Mutual Aid Society or the Congreso Puertorriqueño. The Congreso Puertorriqueño would help them with try to find clothing. They would help them to find apartments. They would take them and help them with interpretation services if they needed to go to a hospital, clinic, or wherever. That's how I felt, how I got to know the Puerto Rican Congress. And I mean, that to me, the person that I remember as from the Puerto Rican Congress was Carlos Ruiz. Carlos Ruiz. He was part of the first 300 Puerto Ricans that had come into the Lakeview community. Primarily, they were women who were brought in from Puerto Rico to do domestic work. And I remember that Carlos Caribe Ruiz, with the Puerto Rican Congress, he began a conservatory of music for the young Puerto Ricans and he helped them to begin so many musical bands that became famous after that throughout the United States. And he always had the rule that if the young Puerto Ricans wanted to be involved in the music in order to become leaders of the band or singers or whatever they wanted to be, they had to stay in school. That was something that he preached over and over and over. I also remember that the Puerto Rican Congress also had something for the participation of females, the women. They had these involvement in the Puerto Rican parade once the parades began, and they would choose a young youth as a representative of the Puerto Rican Congress to be on a float as part of the parade. But he also had the Mrs. Puerto Rico contest, and this was not a beauty pageant. You had to prove that you had been involved in the community, and be involved in your school, be involved in your church, and the life of the entire community in order to be part of this pageant. And I myself was selected as one for 1 year. I think it was in 1980 I became Mrs. Puerto Rico. You can tell it wasn't a beauty pageant because while I was the queen, the Mrs. Puerto Rico, I was pregnant for twins, who is now 34 years old now, a male and a female. And so the Mutual Aid or the Congreso Puertorriqueño did a lot in the Puerto Rican community to educate people about their rights in a way, about the culture, about standing for what we loved, which was our music. And they would also every week have gatherings for the community and the membership to come and celebrate. There were the celebrations of traditional things like the Three Kings Day. There were traditional things like this month we're going to celebrate the people who are all from Aguada or the people who are from Arecibo. And that is something then that grew into something different, because each hometown began to coordinate and to organize in terms of hometown memberships. And so the people from Arecibo had their own club. The people from Aguada had their own club, and they would do their own celebrations, and they would march in the parades as a club from the hometowns. I remember that the Lopez families were big in this beginning of these clubs. When I started getting very involved in the community, it was something that started with the community in Lakeview, where because the Puerto Rican community, we started being displaced from the area where I was growing, which was around the area that everybody would call the Loop, or the downtown area. Many of us, we didn't even know, oh, this is the Loop, this is the downtown. To us, it was just another ghetto. But once we started moving north, we ended up in communities around the area of Armitage, Halstead, where there was a high school around there, the Waller. Now it's a well-known different school. My family, we also ended up moving to the Lakeview community, and that's the community that is around the area of Diversey, Clark, and Broadway, near the lake. It was a community that was, many people described it as a three-layer community. And that was a three-layer community because from the lake to about Halstead, it was the well-to-do community members, primarily Jewish. And then from Halstead to about, I would say, Lincoln, it was a area where you had a lot of individuals that were left behind by progress, who were people from Germany, German descent, and in between there we were the Latinos, primarily Puerto Ricans, were living in that area between Halstead and west towards, I would say, going towards Western. It was in that community where we began organizing a lot. We formed organizations, 4 small organizations, and one was based at a church, St. Sebastian Church. Another organization was based around Morris High School, grade school, and another one was based near another community in Lemoyne. And then what we did was we took these small community organizations and we formed a coalition, and that coalition became known as the Lakeview Latin American Coalition. That's the organization that later on I became the lead organizer of. Some of the people that were very influential in those days with forming of this was Charlie Kyle, who was oh, a priest of the Catholic Church at St. Sebastian. We had Reverenda Fines Flores, who was with the United Methodist Church. We also had individuals like Fernando Prieto, who was from Colombia. And so it was an organization that believed that we needed to look outside of just the community of Lakeview, because our survival depended on forming alliances with others. And so we did a lot of work I remember that we worked with the South Side during the formation of the Cardinals Committee. The Cardinals Committee with Seferino Ochoa, a member of the Mexican community, came to our community of Lakeview to educate us about the services that we could obtain through the church. Then we also formed alliances with progressive organizations that were in the Mexican community and in the African American community. In the Lakeview Latin American Coalition is where we did a lot of organizing. We had we organized by issues. Whenever there was the issue of employment and the fact that we needed to open doors with a corporation or an employer or somewhere, then what we would do we would reach out to other organizations that were doing similar work, and we would go and approach them. I remember that we worked to make sure that at Illinois, at that time it's Illinois Bell, and we approached them, and we also went and approached them at that time it was like the Major Jewel Corporation, and we approached them and we said we need to have an affirmative action program for Latinos to be able to enter into employment in your corporation. Many times it was we had to protest because I remember with Charlie Kyle and myself and the Allies for a Better Community, which was Hector Franco, Carlos Flores, and others, we took over the building where Jewel was housed, and we protested there, and to the point that they said that they would oust it. They would oust us from the building, even if it meant inflicting us harm. And so Charlie Kyle said, hey, if they're going to call and they call police on us, if they're going to arrest us and all of that, right now what we need to do is we should call the media. we should call ambulances and be ready. And so we did, though. We did that. And we became very famous for that action, and we did win. We won. They did put together an affirmative action program, and many Latinos were hired through that. The same thing happened with the Social Security office in the Lakeview community. We had a woman that came to our office and said, you know what? We went to the Social Security office and they told us that we had to come back on another day because we have to bring an interpreter with us. And we said, they told you exactly that way? And so we went to the Social Security office, and sure enough, there was a sign at the Social Security office that said that if you do not speak or understand English, come back on another day with a friend or an interpreter. And so what we did was we got the son of Carlos of the owner of the El Puertorriqueño newspaper, and he was a photographer, and he went there and he took pictures of the office of Social Security. He took pictures of the actual sign that said come back on another day. And then what we did was we went and we met with people from the Justice Department, and we left behind the evidence. And then we went and invited as many seniors that we could, including Trina Davila, and we sat inside the local office of a Social Security office. The manager there believed that there was going to be a lot of trouble there, and so we were surrounded by, I remember, squad cars all over the place. What they didn't know was that we had brought our own media representatives with us. And so immediately that became a change in our community, because the Social Security office immediately were told that they had to take down any and all signs that seemed to be discriminatory towards us Latinos, and they then had to start a program by which they would do recruitment and hiring of Latinos who were fully bilingual, and that was a victory for us in the community, because not only did we impact one little office, we impacted a whole system. Another program, another action that we took was when we started doing a lot of the political organizing. We formed a group, and we had the Puerto Rican Organization for Political Action, PROPA. That was headed up by Hector Franco. We had the ABC, which was Allies for a Better Community. We had the Lakeview Latin American Coalition, and other groups that were just beginning to form politically, like Andy Goitia and Pacheco and many others. And we had allies again with people from churches. At that time we had the Reverendo Alvarez, who later on became very involved and started what is now known as Casa Central, services for seniors and children. He was very involved with us in terms of the political organizing. Um, when we started doing the voter registration, we noticed that many of the newcomers coming into our communities were not able to exercise the right to register and to vote because of the language situation, that they could not speak English. And so we 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 started to coordinate our efforts, and PROPA came in, and the leadership from PROPA, Puerto Rican Organization for Political Action, met with the leadership from the Lakeview Latin Coalition, and I remember that we decided that there was a need to do a lawsuit, and in order to prepare for that lawsuit, there were a group of attorneys that helped us out. I remember that some of the attorneys like Kalman Rasnick, I think there was Sweeney and others involved. And one of the my task was to work with the young males that we found through Universidad Popular. Universidad Popular was one of our Lakeview Latin American creations. Universidad Popular was the adult education component of our coalition. And we found the young people that then were willing to say, yes, we want to be part of this lawsuit. And so now we needed to make sure they understood what they were entering into, and that they knew that this was something that was going to take a long time, and that they would need to go into a courtroom, and that they would needed to testify, and that they would be subject to be asked all sorts of questions. And so I myself would meet with them, and when we would help them through the briefing that was going to take place. Then when we went to the courtroom, the community joined us from all over the city. It wasn't just members from the Lakeview community or members from the West Town area or the Humboldt Park area. We have people from all over. And I remember that when the judge began, the judge that we were before in the federal court was, I believe it was Judge Philip Tone. I remember that I was in the courtroom, and we had Vicente Gatica Starete, who was a reporter from our community who used to follow our actions from PROPA, from the ABC and Lakeview Latin American Coalition. He used to follow whatever the young lords were doing in those days, and he would write all of this. And he was in the courtroom with us, and all of a sudden they were asking me the question of, what is your name? And I would state my name. And what is your address? And I would state. And then all of a sudden I got this question, and do you speak English? And I'm like, I thought I was speaking English all this time, and it wasn't that I was trying to be funny, but I thought there was out of order to ask that type of question when we were there to make a point. Um, the this lawsuit that was brought on by Propa and the Lakeview Coalition and other organizations that participated was very, very key in the life of Puerto Ricans all over the United States, because we proved that, you know, that even though we were saying, you know, we're Puerto Ricans, we're Puerto Ricans by by birth, but yet you're not allowing us to exercise our right to speak our own language. When the United States took us over, they didn't say we had to, as a condition of being U.S. citizens, that we had to give up our language. And therefore, in that lawsuit, we proved that we didn't have to give up our language in order to exercise the right to vote, or exercise any of the other rights that we were fighting for. The we lost, we won this lawsuit, and one of the things that helped us with this was that now the Board of Elections had to print material in our language, Spanish, but not only now, many other languages benefited from our lawsuit, because up now many of the communities are able to exercise their right to vote and get materials in their own languages, because you now see the Board of Election printing materials in the Chinese community. They're printing it in the Polish community, in the Spanish community, and so everybody won in this lawsuit, and it was the Puerto Ricans that opened the door for that. Not only was there a benefit in terms of changing the right to vote in our own language, the lawsuit also opened the door so that many of the small businesses that were printers, they would get business from the Board of Elections to print the materials in those languages, in the Spanish language. And then also the Latino media or the Spanish media also benefited, because the Board of Elections had to now pay to put advertisement in them to let us know, everybody know about their voting rights and their election, when the elections were coming up, etc. So I think this was key in the history of Puerto Ricans throughout the whole United States. One of the things that we also did with the Lakeview Latin American Coalition was that we were a organizing body, but many a times we knew that some things had to be taken care of with the development of programs. So we just couldn't organize and leave it at that. As an example, when we began organizing in terms of getting Latinos to employed, we found out that, wait a minute, employers are telling us we cannot employ you because you don't even have the basic English to understand safety issues in the place where you want to work. And therefore, we had to say, oh, well, what do you do? What do we do with this now? Now we need to do something different. So we started looking at, do we go out and find a place where we can teach them English, or do we create our own place? And we did. As the Lakeview Latin American Coalition got stronger, we created what was called as Universidad Popular. Mind you, we chose a name of Universidad Popular because we wanted to think big. But it was just an operation of one teacher, 14 students in a basement rented by a friend of ours. And that's how we began Universidad Popular, which then became a recognized institution through city colleges of Chicago. And one of the things that we're doing with Universidad Popular was we were using the concepts of Paulo Freire, whom we had the privilege of bringing to Illinois, and many of us participated in his teachings. Some of the people that were participating with us were Omar Lopez, Dr. Samuel Betances, myself, Hector Franco, etc. And the Universidad Popular used the teachings of Paulo Freire. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that we did one day was we had a classroom of Latinos, and we asked them to go up to the board. And we said, it doesn't matter how you spell the word, just tell us what are the types of words that you hear in the place where you work. And you wouldn't believe the types of words that came up on the board. The most insulting words that were being used by their bosses. And so we had to address what was happening with the students in their home, in their jobs. And another thing we had to do was address, while we were teaching the students and the community members to learn English, we were also teaching them about tenants' rights, because they would come into the classroom and they didn't know that they have rights. And so we organized our tenant rights group through the coalition. When we continued to open the doors with corporations and other employers, we had to create Universidad Popular, Una Puerta Abierta. Una Puerta Abierta was the creation of the Lakeview Latin American Coalition, and Una Puerta Abierta was the program that would recruit employers, so that we could then open the door and increase the employment in our communities. Again, many other organizations came from throughout the city to be part of this, because if we found an employer that was being resistant about opening the door for the employment of Latinos, then we will all approach them as a group. Um, um, I was also participating in um, making sure that the Lakeview Latin American Coalition would grow through funding. I remember that our very first funding source was the Campaign for Human Development, and that was a effort through the Catholic Church. So here I go back to the Catholic Church. And so the church gave us our very first funding, and it was so that we could hire an organizer. And then once we found other funding, we were able to hire a couple of other organizers, like one that would work with us on the housing and tenant issues. We had one that would, Gloria Perez, that worked very closely in terms of the issues of education. That was the time that we were doing a lot of organizing in about 5 or 6 schools in the community, because they did not have bilingual education. And then the bilingual education that we started talking about with Maria Cerda, who became the very first member of the Board of Education. Maria Cerda herself being a Puerto Rican woman, okay? Started talking about transitional bilingual education. And so we now had to organize the different schools that were in our community to go back down to the Board of Education to say we need a lot more than what we are getting right now. And thank God for people like Maria Cerda, and thank God for people like Dr. Isidro Lucas, and thank God for people like Charlie Kyle, who would come to our organization and bring the resources. I remember that one of the efforts with Dr. Isidro Lucas was that Dr. Isidro Lucas, he is the one that did the Puerto Rican dropouts in Chicago study. It was in 1971. And even though it was Dr. Isidro Lucas, and we thanked him, and we thank him, and we will continue to thank him, nobody paid attention to that study until Charlie Kyle, who was the priest from St. Sebastian, who was also a founding member of the Lakeview Latin American Coalition, said, we need to do something about this. We cannot take this study and just put it under a rug. We need to highlight what is happening in this community with the dropouts. And I remember that we started organizing on the issue of dropouts. And I remember that we would take to highlight it so that the community have a vivid picture of this. We would parade and we would march with coffins that would have the word dropout on the coffins. And we even paraded and protested in front of the Cardinals mansion on the north side. I believe that had Charlie Kyle, a former priest, had not looked at this, we probably would have not been able to accomplish what Dr. Isidro had wanted us to accomplish with that dropout study. Sorry.